Hello, welcome to another episode of the Rippling Pages podcast with me, Liam Bishop, a writer from Leeds, and today I'm joined by another writer who lives in Leeds, Caitlin Stobie. Born in South Africa, Caitlin completed her PhD at the University of Leeds, which is where she now works. She was named by the literary journal New Contrast as a rising star in South African poetry, and since then, she's been the recipient of the Douglas Livingstone Creative Writing Competition Prize and the Heather Drummond Memorial Prize for Poetry. Many of her poems are featured in the likes of PM Review and Stand, and they've culminated in this collection, Thin Slices, published by Verve Press. In the collection, Caitlin examines language's ability to capture experience at all levels of life. Indeed, some of her poems seem to examine life in its pre-lingual state. Caitlin does this by utilising poetry in what we might call more traditional forms, but visual forms too. Caitlin joined me from Leeds. Hi, Caitlin. Thank you very much for joining me today. Can we just start by talking about the title?
Thin slices arose. The first time I encountered the term, I was organising a conference called Beastly Modernisms at the University of Glasgow. And we had organised a tour of the Hunterian collections. So we were being taken around these galleries of taxidermied animals, specimens of rocks. And one of the people who was leading the tours was explaining the process of thin slicing these specimens in order to see what was inside. And that image stuck with me. And I remember making a note on my phone, thin slices. For some reason, I thought that would make a great poem, or that would be something to think about in a poem. But then I sat on that thought and realized that the reason why it had stuck with me was because it resonated with a review I read on brain pickings years and years before of Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. So, but it came back to me and I thought, oh, that's interesting because that's thin slicing on a psychological level. That's thinking about how we judge people based on a moment, an interaction. And I saw that several of the poems that I was working on were doing a similar thing. So I was attracted to the title because it seemed to speak to very tangible questions of ecology, of examining things under a microscope. But then also there was this broader sense of psychological dynamics that I found appealing. I also was reading Chelsea Girls by Eileen Myles, and that phrase came up in a completely different context, but one that I also think is relevant. So Chelsea Girls is discussing, I mean, it's crucial to feminism and thinking through gender, but also that the particular passage where that comes through is discussing eating. And I was realizing that several of my poems were unpicking the difficult associations of being a feminist and being interested in environmentalism, but also then that may be inflicting one's relationship with eating, the dynamics of ethical eating and how that's often gendered.
And what I really like about it is that it is so there's something quite visceral about it, something that kind of makes you feel it on your, I don't know, on your skin or within your body when you say it. Something, I don't say it makes you sort of shiver, but it makes you think about your sort of corporality. And he talks about some of the various different themes that it does tie into there. And what I find quite ironic is that Malcolm Gladwell, based on what the epigraph you provide, it's about the limited perceptions of the world. And there's such an expansive array of themes that you talk about there, how it relates to feminism, how it relates to kind of corporality and that kind of thing. Is it the fact that there are various definitions of the world that you're interested in, or is it more to do with the fact that this collection is more about people that have limited perceptions of the world?
I would say it's both. And I think it's part of why again, the thin slicing appeals to me because I think there's a zooming in on a particular perspective, a particular setting. South Africa obviously crops up in several of the poems. And I think that's a very specific environment that perhaps is not fully understood unless you've been there, although that could be said for anywhere. So on some levels, I guess also your question makes me think about the fact that the reason why this collection went through so many different titles and changes is because I was speaking with South African publishers and British publishers at the same time. And a lot of the South African publishers were saying to me, there's no market in South Africa for poems that are set in Leeds. And then the people in the UK were saying, what on earth is this Zulu word? So I felt like I had two audiences that I had to think about constantly. And I wanted to zoom in on specificities, but I also wanted there to be a sense of the universal, the transcendental, relatable issues. So Gladwell's perspective, I think, is useful because we do make quick judgment calls about the person based on their accent, where they grew up, all these quick things that we will think when we first encounter someone. So in a way, I was thinking about how the poetry would be received. And I found Gladwell useful for that. And also because several of the poems are limited in their scope, and as much as I think that, I hope that the poems that address South Africa, for example, will be broadening people's understandings and perceptions, they are also just my one person's perspectives from having grown up in a different environment. So there's that sense of how much the narrative speaker can actually do that I hit up against at several points in the collection.
Did you sort of meet your limits as a poet too?
I definitely tried to experiment with narrative positioning.
Right.
So there are poems in here that I wrote when I was a teenager, and those are often a lot more classic poetic literary form, thinking about there'll be free verse, but nothing too wacky. And then the later poems would be things that I wrote in collaboration with the scientists, where I was really thinking, okay, well, how can we write about something that's not even human? And how does the human voice fit into that? How can I, as a poet, narrate this without centralizing the narrative or lyric I? So I found myself pushing up against language in a way that I wasn't quite expecting.
It was felt like you were exploring a time of cultures of limited language, either as people, either as cultures in, I don't mean cultures as sort of peoples and humans, I mean cultures as, biological cultures and that kind of thing. And places where there might not be such a thing as language.
It was a recurring conversation with the scientists that I was working with at Leeds. So while I was really shaping this collection together, I was also doing a collaboration with the Beals Research Group at the University of Leeds. They are a group of biophysicists doing very interesting work on multiple things, but broadly speaking, they're interested in engineering the components of artificial life. So it sounds like what they're doing is making artificial cells. It's not that simple, but they are creating parts of what might be one day artificial cells. So we found ourselves speaking a lot about the words or language that we shared between us as different disciplines. I come from a background where I'm interested in the origins of life in terms of conception and thinking about reproductive health. So I was interested in it from the organic sense, and they were interested in it in terms of, okay, well, at what point can we say that this little tiny thing that we've engineered is living? And we were using the same words, but they meant completely different things. So again, I was finding that language gets us in a lot of trouble a lot of the time. And I think many poets are aware of this. Many poets play around with language for exactly that reason. It was that shared vocabulary that I was interested in exploring. So, for example, there's emergence. Emergence is a concept that rears its head in both the type of feminist philosophy that I was reading and in the biophysical research that these researchers were doing. We kind of came to an understanding of emergence that we could respect each other's viewpoints. But then there were other words. I think it was interesting to find common ground, but then also several of the poems just made me realize that perhaps we need different languages for different, for the sake of specificity. Thinking more broadly about what you said earlier in terms of cultures and pre-linguistic narration, or if these poems are doing that, I don't know how conscious it was, but certainly in the sense that I was thinking about origins and origin myth and when life begins and then how that's narrated. I can see how that could be read when looking through this collection, definitely.
Yeah, this idea of origin myths, I didn't necessarily think it was a critique of a particular origin myth, but I felt like you were looking at origin myths as a kind of cultural product, as a way to anchor our perceptions of the world. What is it about origin myths that so fascinates you?
I think growing up in South Africa, it's a very religious country, And although on paper we have a very secular liberal democracy, which surprises some people, in practice, there is still a lot of reverence for various myths. And I'm not just thinking of the kind of biblical tradition, although that often is present. And that's why I'm engaging with the Genesis and other myths throughout the collection. So that's definitely was on my mind, that that received wisdom that had been present growing up, and that we also see in literary culture and history as a kind of reference point when discussing life. It's very compelling and easy for people to use these metaphors. Even if you look at research papers in the sciences, a lot of these papers that are discussing potential for creating artificial cells in life are using these tropes of origin myths that are actually quite gendered. And so I wanted to interrogate what that means, and not necessarily to dismiss them, but just to be a bit more critical of why we're repeating, what happens when we repeat these myths, when we think about mothering in a certain way. How does that function? What are we missing out?
What does happen, do you think?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think while I was writing this collection, I was doing a PhD on abortion narratives. So I think that question of what's left out came about because I was reading so many texts that were very explicitly talking about impolite things that we don't often discuss, for want of not wanting to shock people, not wanting to traumatize people. But what was interesting about the literary texts that I was reading as a scholar was that they were very frank, very bodily, and they were unashamed as well. So I thought, okay, that's interesting that not many people want to talk about such embodied experiences. How can poetry do what these novelists are doing? In a way, some of the poems are a response to the literature that I was reading while I was writing my PhD.
Why was it a poetic response?
There's several reasons. The first is that from a young age, I found that poetry is a good way of condensing thoughts into the basic crux of the issue. I knew that there were several themes that I wanted to explore, and I felt that a single linear narrative wouldn't necessarily encapsulate everything that I wanted to address. So the themes that have always interested me are intersecting. I've always been interested in how feminism speaks to environmentalism, speaks to medical issues, and see them as quite intertwined. And I think this is now becoming more popular, especially given the last 3 years, and where we are now because of the pandemic. I think it's become more acceptable to say, without a shadow of a doubt, medical issues are environmental and vice versa. So I wanted to use poems because, and this goes back to our discussion of Gladwell, on the one hand, you're zooming in, and on the one hand, you only get to discuss one image or idea, and you only have a certain amount of lines in order to explore it. But on the other hand, it allows you to cut through and make associations that you might not be able to unveil so directly in a longer prose form narrative. Something about the relationship between science and poetry I also find quite appealing. I think that there's an interesting juxtapositions between the two.
And biology as a response to origin myths. I guess it seems like even biology, even science has its own versions of origin myths.
I wouldn't want this collection to seem like it's offering science as a solution in juxtaposition to the origin myths that I'm critical of, because science is equally cultured. And that was one of the most interesting things of working with the scientists, was seeing how there's this divide that popular culture tends to make between science as being very rational and thinking that it doesn't use your creative brain when you're being a scientist, which could not be further from the truth. I've seen people doing all sorts of things in the lab that I would never even imagine of doing. And even the writing up of a paper in science is creative. It's a form of prose. You need to think through how you're communicating. So it was seeing how the skills that I learned as a writer are present in the lab, but then also from the scientist perspective, I think seeing the methodology of writing in a way that some of my students would know very well, but perhaps people who have a background in the sciences might not necessarily think of, like, it is work and you do have to be methodological and you do have to test a hypothesis in some ways.
One of the kind of recurring figures within this collection is Eve. And I don't know if it's the Eve that we associate with Christianity. But was this something that you noticed yourself? Is it something that came out in the collection, or was it an idea that you actually explicitly wanted to tackle?
Definitely the latter. And yes and no. It is the Eve that we read of and think of and see represented countless times. In Jealousy Experiment, I talk about the way that painters will, not dare to paint Eve and Adam without a leaf. And so I was interested in depictions of Eve, if there was a real Eve, But I also wanted to draw on that figure and reclaim that figure and think about mythological various figures from myths. So there's also Echo in one of my poems. I wanted to think about the literary heritage of these figures and how, in a way, they are almost mothers of a feminist tradition, if we wanted to reclaim them and think of them that way. So Eve is interesting, obviously, because you've got the associations with sin, with sex, an endlessly fascinating figure that you can draw so much out of. Eve is particularly interesting because of the associations with childbirth, and several of the poems, again, were written when I was thinking and writing every day about abortion, miscarriage, childbirth. So I wrote initially about her in one poem, but then I found she kept creeping back in. When we go to Genesis, we see that Eve is punished, and the punishment is bearing in pain you shall bear forth children. So the sense that childbirth is punishment, that's the result of being curious. I mean, there's a bind there between curiosity and knowledge and all these acts that we associate with reading, and then reproduction, gendered reproduction, because man isn't punished in the reproductive act in that narrative. So that's the association. Without wanting to get too simplistic about the gender binary or anything like that, I think that if you're thinking about childbirth and abortion and narration of these acts, Eve is a fascinating figure to throw into that mix.
Eve became such an interesting character with so many dimensions, and I think that's what came to life. But one of the things I do love about her, and that I think you really brought to light, was this kind of palindromic name that she has. Very short but palindromic, and there's a lot of your poems, they do come back on themselves. And you spoke about Echo and Narcissus, and some of your poems, you start them and end them in a similar way, or visually they kind of refer back to themselves. Is there a wider cultural idea here about Eve and about poetry?
When I was ordering the poems, I tried hard to think about how they would speak to each other and echo, if I can use that word. It speaks to several things, I'd say. It speaks to the sense of circularity of life. This sounds quite trite maybe, but the circle of life in a way. Repetition, I think, is always a useful poetic device. I use it with my students when they get stuck. I say just repeat the start of the last line until something new emerges. So I find it useful for myself if I'm stuck in a writing phase. But I do like a resonance between the first line and the ending. I think there's something quite neat about that. A lot of my favorite poems do that. And the palindromic words have always appealed to me. Definitely when I was writing the visual poems, I found myself, there's the bilayer, where I'm trying to explore with repetition and forming meaning through reversing sentences in a way that I'd never done before, and is very challenging, but also rewarding when you find that it does maybe make sense.
But yeah, Caitlin, you work with a school of poets who are also obviously lecturers, and this fantastic creative environment. But if you would like to see some of the other poets that Caitlin works with, you can see them at Ilkley Literature Festival, which is the second oldest literature festival in the UK. and next year will be celebrating its golden anniversary. The festival runs over 17 days in October, set in the countryside, stone's throw from Leeds Bradford Airport. Caitlin will be appearing at University of Leeds Poetry Showcase, along with Kimberly Campanelle, John Whale, Zafar Kuniel on Wednesday, the 19th of October. And at the time of speaking, you can still get some tickets. And there are still events that have not sold out yet. Including with the likes of Mallory Blackman. And I know that we've spoken about Eve and the punishment and the pain of birth, and you've spoken about some of your previous work. Was this why you were asking questions about attachment?
The elements of attachment in the collection arose before I really had an understanding. So one of the earlier poems I wrote was Carried, and I was looking back over it when we were talking about having this interview, and I saw the word attachment there, and I thought, oh, that's so interesting, because I wrote that when I definitely hadn't encountered attachment theory. I didn't, in recent years there's been a lot of theorization of attachment and this kind of Instagramization, let me just make a word for it, of attachment theory and content. And so in more recent years, I've been thinking about it as a school of thought in psychology. But obviously, attachment arises whenever we have an address to the second person, really. Whenever there's any address, and I love the second person. I think it's great. I think it's great fun to write to, right from the perspective of the lyric I to the second person. And that's another thing that maybe South African poetry does more and is more comfortable with, is that sense of intimacy. I encountered when I first started writing and reading in the UK context, a lot of people will say, oh, well, it's quite personal, and you might want to think about, moving away from so much use of I, for example. And I do try to play with that at times, but I also want to stand by the fact that I think that can be productive, and there's nothing wrong with a love poem or a poem about mothering or fatherhood. It's just opening it up with the imagery. That's a challenge.
I was curious when you might have moved over from South Africa. But yeah, because obviously there is a lot of references to attachment, a lot of references to South Africa, and but yeah, either way, and I wonder if that's why you've talked about the different narrative perspective. You talk about the importance. There's always feels like there's importance of an other, and that's not always gendered either. And I don't know if that was other idea in this idea of attachment. Was it fair to say that there was instances of you exploring what it means to perhaps move themselves away from a culture or a particular person?
Definitely, I think the sense of leaving something behind it preoccupies many South African writers. Even J.M. Coetzee has had his reckoning with that. So I think that's has been on my mind for a long time, and it was about the time of the move, really, that I started putting the poems together in a collection. One of the earlier titles was really thinking about this question that you raised earlier of language, and thinking about the languages that I experienced growing up versus the very monoglot culture in the UK, and some resonances, but mostly differences. So yeah, I think that it would be fair to say that there is a sense of loss in some of the poems, or rather mourning certain things, but also moments of connection, and trying to reconcile the two and see the beauty in both.
What do we leave behind?
Connections with others, connection with the landscape. I think I was just speaking with a friend earlier, actually, about the kind of climate of South Africa, and he was asking, what were seasons like in South Africa? Do you even have proper seasons? And the answer is, it depends where you are. We have about 11 different biomes, and I miss being able to travel to another biome an hour's drive, and you're in a completely different type of climate. It's very different to the UK in some ways. Although I'm leaning into sweater weather this year. I'm trying to embrace this part of the world as well, and its own peculiarities. But environment comes through a lot. I think there's something very tangible and corporeal when you leave a place that we maybe don't think of. We often think of who we're leaving behind, but also there's a physicality of what you're leaving behind.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived here 31 years now, and it doesn't feel any less peculiar. So don't worry about that. It only gets more peculiar by the day, I think. Crikey.
That's true.
Um, Could we talk about it? Because we have spoken about the other, and there's spoken about the times you don't mention and other, if you will. But there's this word that comes up a couple of times, and it's grandmothering. What's the difference? Is this a theoretical concept? Is it a concept that you've applied? It's not something I've encountered.
There's this, I'm thinking now of Nicola Pera and the other kind of psychologists thinking about attachment through a complex lens. So she speaks about generational trauma, which again is kind of doing the rounds at the moment. It's almost a meme, but the sense that we can't really blame the generation that immediately precedes us for everything, because they in turn have been facing their own struggles. So it's very easy to make glib um, dismissals of boomers or Gen X or whatever else, and to see this divide with Gen Z and us as millennials. But I think that's, well, a lot of people I think are starting to come to terms with the fact that that is simplistic, but it's thinking about why it is that we're in the state that we're in, and realizing that that's due to generational trauma and violences that have occurred for centuries. I mean, again, I'm thinking of Eve. This is not anything new. The sense of people not understanding how to relate, not understanding political inequalities. These are all things that persist and have persisted for thousands of years. So when I was evoking the grandmother, I guess it started from the place of being interested in the dynamics of South Africa, where my grandparents' generation was so completely different to, just the kind of fabric of society was so different to what I was exposed to and lived in. It started from that point and then became a broader sense of thinking through mothering and what we do and don't attribute to motherhood as a generational thing, and what might be lacking from one's mother or from one's idea of motherhood is not simply to do with one direct linear attachment. It's a communal thing. This is quite common in South Africa. That trope, it takes a village to raise a child, but we have a sense of communal responsibility and thinking through respect for older generations. Not to say that they're off the hook, but rather to understand their perspectives. I think that's something that I'm very grateful for, having grown up in a South Africa where we would think about that.
Yeah, when you say, so understanding a different generation, what do we get from understanding?
I think it helps us to understanding older generations or different generations helps to understand the way that the current state of affairs, and again, I'm interested particularly in gender. So that's why I do gender it as grandmothering, and I'm interested in. I mean, there's references to father time and other constructs throughout the collection, but it's this idea of the grandmother, I guess, because of the matrilineal line, and thinking about what we understand as womanhood, what we understand as natural when we think about gender. What does it mean to be a natural woman? What does it mean to be a woman at all? I like that you picked up on the fact that a lot of the second person address was genderless. That's deliberate. I think that there's a lot of really interesting work being done at the moment about challenging gender norms, and that's really important. But I think it's interesting to also view how the gender norms that we have are just received ideas that perhaps older generations were also not happy with, but didn't have the tools to really critique.
Just, in the word mother is the word other. And it made me think about, this idea of, and this sort of perception around mothering that we place on it. And you talked about the Instagramification of attachment. And it really is, Winnicott sort of said this. It's about the idea of a good enough mother. That's the sort of best we can hope for, really. Definitely not the perfect, because obviously nobody's perfect, and we ask a lot. We ask a lot of mothers. I think we ask a lot of more of mothers than we do of fathers, without a doubt.
Yeah, I think going back to the discussion of Eve, I think that was part of what her figure served to interrogate, was what do we ask of women when we ask them to be mothers, and what happens when they can't, for whatever reason, or they don't want to be. So the actual poem Eve is a miscarriage poem, and I suppose that was what I was trying to play around with there, was the thought, well, what if Eve had a miscarriage? What happens when we don't adhere to the scripts that we're given, whatever that gendered script might be?
I mean, what does happen? What do you think happens, Caitlin? What is the worst that can happen? Is Eve's fate a kind of example of that? Is that the lesson in this?
I don't know if I have a lesson to give anyone. I don't know if poetry should be giving a lesson to anyone. I think it should be causing people to pause and think, and maybe reassess what they associate with motherhood, with womanhood, with grandmothers, with grandmothering, with mothering oneself. Because I think that's also part of the discourse that we see on this Instagramification of therapy in general, is the sense of your inner child and mothering yourself or parenting yourself. And I think, yes, that's useful if you know what parenthood is, what to do with that. Perhaps less useful is giving people a lesson without them really having understood what they want to do first. So I wouldn't want to say that they're cautionary poems and that Eve's figure is, there are no moments of I like to leave it open. I'd say I like to leave it open for people to decide.
Caitlin Stobie, it has been a fascinating discussion and an absolute pleasure to have you here. This is the last episode of the series, and we've brought it back to Leeds in a way, but then we've taken it back out to South Africa and other places, which is really nice, because we look out internationally on the Rippling pages. So Caitlin, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to discuss everything with you, Liam.
And that's it. Series 3, Beneath the Surface, has come to an end. We will be back for more episodes soon, but until then, keep in touch with the Rippling pages for highlights and upcoming developments. Follow us on social media at Rippling_pages. That's at Rippling_pages. And that's for both Twitter and Instagram. And as always, if you've enjoyed the show, give it a 5-star rating on your favourite podcast provider. This just boosts the visibility of the episodes and in turn, the visibility of these excellent writers who join us for the series. Thanks very much, and until next time.